Greg Baird had worked too hard to let something like this happen. He stood in his front yard, his bare feet sinking into the oversaturated grass, the thick scent of chlorine and mud filling his nostrils. The roar of water had finally stopped, but the damage had already been done. His newly renovated lawn, carefully landscaped with stone pathways and a custom irrigation system, was ruined. His basement, where he stored thousands of dollars worth of antique watches from his business, was flooded. The pristine tiles around his pool were coated in grime and debris. And the man responsible? He was sitting on his porch across the street, drinking a beer like nothing had happened. Greg clenched his fists, watching Michael Crane take a slow sip from his bottle, his feet propped up on the wooden railing of his porch. The same feet that had barely been able to stumble out of his Jeep when he plowed into the fire hydrant in front of Greg's house 2 hours ago. The impact had been so loud that Greg had shot out of bed, thinking a bomb had gone off. Instead, he found his neighbor's SUV mounted on the curb, the front bumper crushed, and water gushing like a geyser into the sky. It had taken the city almost 40 minutes to shut it off. 40 minutes of watching helplessly as his property was destroyed. Greg had seen a lot of things in his life. He'd dealt with stubborn clients, unreliable suppliers, and business partners who would sell their own mothers for an extra dollar. But nothing compared to the sheer arrogance of Michael Crane. The man was a walking disaster, the kind of neighbor that made people check their home's resale value every 6 months. He played music at ungodly hours, let his friends park their rusted trucks on the lawn, and treated the street like his personal racetrack. Greg had tolerated it, until now. He exhaled sharply and started walking across the street, his soaked sweatpants clinging to his legs. The temperature had dropped, and the cold was beginning to seep into his bones, but he ignored it. He wasn't going to bed without answers. Michael barely glanced at him as he approached, casually flicking a cigarette onto the ground. "Hell of a night," he muttered, stretching his legs. Greg stopped at the base of the porch steps, his fists itching to wrap around something solid. "You wrecked my property," he said, voice steady but tight. "You're going to pay for the damages." Michael let out a short, amused breath, shaking his head. That's so he reached for another beer from the case beside him, popped the cap off with his teeth, and took a sip. "Look, man, I get it. You're upset. But I didn't tell the hydrant to jump in front of my car, did I?" Greg's jaw tightened. "You were drunk," Michael smirked. And Greg snapped, stepping closer. "Because of you, my basement is flooded. My yard is destroyed. My property value just took a hit because you can't handle your liquor." Michael raised his hands in mock innocence. "Hey, not my fault you built your house in the wrong spot." Greg stared at him, his fingers curling so tight his nails dug into his palms. He had spent years building his business from the ground up, pouring everything he had into making a life for himself. He had bought this house with the intention of staying here for decades. And now, within the span of one night, this careless bastard had set him back tens of thousands of dollars. "You're going to pay?" Greg repeated, his voice low. Michael took another slow sip, his smirk widening. "Nah, I don't think I will." Something inside Greg snapped. He grabbed the beer from Michael's hand and hurled it into the street, the glass shattering against the pavement. For the first time that night, Michael's expression darkened. "You want to try that again?" he said, standing up. He was taller than Greg by a couple of inches, broader too, but Greg didn't move. "You'll pay," Greg said again, this time with absolute certainty. "One way or another." Michael chuckled, but there was something colder behind it now. He patted Greg's shoulder as he walked past him, down the steps. "Good luck with that." Greg watched him disappear inside, the screen door slamming shut. He took a deep breath, then turned and walked back toward his ruined lawn. The street was quiet now, except for the distant hum of passing cars. The air smelled of wet asphalt and chlorine. He had no idea how much this would cost to fix, but he knew one thing for certain. Michael Crane had just made a very, very big mistake. The next morning, Greg Baird woke up to a house that felt foreign. His once pristine home now carried the scent of damp wood, mildew creeping in through the soaked foundation. The basement was a disaster zone, waterlogged shelves, priceless antique watches submerged in murky water, and an eerie silence that made his stomach twist. He hadn't slept more than a few hours, his mind racing with numbers, damage estimates, and one unshakable thought: Michael Crane wasn't going to get away with this. He showered, dressed, and made his first call to his insurance company. The woman on the other end of the line listened patiently as he explained what had happened, her tone neutral but distant, like she'd already decided the outcome before he finished. "We'll send an adjuster out," she said. "But just so you know, damage caused by external water sources may not be covered under your policy unless you have additional flood protection." Greg tightened his grip on the phone. "You're telling me that if my own plumbing had burst, I'd be fine, but because some idiot crashed into a hydrant and sent thousands of gallons of water onto my property, I might be screwed?" "There are some nuances to it," she replied smoothly. "I'd advise waiting for the adjuster's report before making any assumptions." Greg muttered a curse under his breath and hung up. He didn't have time for insurance loopholes. He needed action. Stepping outside, the full extent of the damage hit him all over again. His yard, once carefully manicured, looked like a battlefield. The expensive stone pathways he'd installed last year were now uneven, some stones displaced entirely by the force of the water. His wooden deck had absorbed so much moisture that parts of it were already warping. He spotted a neighbor, an older man named Richard, walking his dog on the opposite side of the street, shaking his head as he passed. Greg ignored him and marched straight across the street. He wasn't in the mood for subtlety. Michael was going to deal with this now. He banged on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. After a few moments, the door cracked open just enough for Michael to lean against the frame, shirtless, a cup of coffee in one hand. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair a mess. "Jesus, Baird, you ever hear of waiting until a man's had his coffee?" Greg took a deep breath. "You're paying for the damage. I've already started the claims process, and if the insurance doesn't cover it, you will." Michael took a slow sip from his cup like he had all the time in the world. "I think I made myself clear last night. I'm not paying for shit." Greg's jaw clenched. "You crashed into the hydrant, Michael. It wasn't a tree, it wasn't a deer, it was a fire hydrant. The city's going to come after you too." Michael smirked. "Good thing I've got a good lawyer then," Greg exhaled sharply. "So that's it? You're just going to pretend this isn't your problem?" Michael tilted his head, considering something. Then he smiled, a slow, lazy expression that made Greg's blood boil. "You ever think maybe the hydrant shouldn't have been there in the first place?" Greg's stomach twisted. "What the hell are you talking about?" Michael shrugged. "Just saying. I was talking to a buddy of mine last night. Turns out the city's had complaints about that hydrant before. Poor placement, too close to the curb. Could be that someone put it there against code." He grinned, taking another sip of his coffee. "Wouldn't that be something?" Greg narrowed his eyes. "That's bullshit." "Maybe," Michael admitted, "but maybe not. And if it turns out that hydrant was placed illegally, well, then I guess it's the city's fault, not mine. And if they're responsible for it, that means they're responsible for the damage too." Greg's mind raced. That was impossible. The hydrant had been there for years, long before he'd moved in. But what if Michael was right? What if there had been some paperwork mistake? The city would bury this for months in bureaucracy, and by then Greg's house would be falling apart. He took a step closer. "You think you can stall your way out of this?" Michael chuckled. "I don't think. I know." He drained the last of his coffee, then tossed the empty mug onto a chair. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got some sleep to catch up on. Last night was a hell of a ride." Greg wanted to break something. Instead, he turned and stormed back to his house, his mind already running through the next steps. If Michael thought he could manipulate the system, he had another thing coming. By noon, Greg had gathered every document he had on the property: surveys, city records, old utility bills. He drove downtown to the municipal office, ready to get answers. But the moment he stepped up to the counter and asked about the hydrant's placement, the clerk frowned. "That's odd," she muttered, flipping through a file on her screen. The records for that hydrant were updated last year. Greg leaned in. "Updated how?" She hesitated. "Well, it looks like the land it sits on was reassigned. Technically, it's on private property. His stomach dropped. Whose property? She clicked a few more times, then looked up at him. Michael Crane's. Greg stepped back, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. That was impossible. The hydrant had been public property, it was city infrastructure. How does that even happen, he demanded. The clerk shook her head. Sometimes property lines get adjusted. It's rare, but not unheard of. Greg's hands curled into fists. Michael had known. That's why he'd been so smug. He'd somehow managed to get the city to adjust the lot lines, moving the hydrant into his property's boundary, which meant that technically it was no longer city infrastructure. Which meant the city wouldn't be coming after him for repairs. Which meant Greg had just lost his biggest leverage. He turned and left without another word, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just carelessness, this was deliberate. And if Michael thought he was going to get away with it, he was dead wrong. Greg Baird couldn't just let this go. The realization that Michael Crane had somehow transferred the land under the fire hydrant into his own name was more than just a bureaucratic trick, it was a calculated move, planned long before the accident ever happened. This wasn't just negligence. This wasn't just arrogance. This was a man who had manipulated the system to cover himself, knowing full well that if something went wrong, he'd have an escape route. And now Greg was standing on the wreckage of his own home, watching the water damage creep deeper into his foundation, while Michael sat back and smirked like he had already won. Greg wasn't the type to throw his hands up and walk away. He had built his business from the ground up by finding solutions to impossible problems, by refusing to be outplayed. Michael thought he had buried his tracks well enough to avoid consequences, but he had underestimated one thing: Greg's persistence. If the system was working in Michael's favor, then Greg would find a way to turn it against him. The first call he made was to Eric Stanton, his attorney. Eric wasn't a litigator, but he was sharp, and more importantly, he knew the right people. When Greg explained what had happened, Eric let out a long whistle on the other end of the line. "That's not an accident," he said. "Lot line adjustments don't just happen. Someone either owed him a favor, or he paid someone off to make that change without raising red flags." "Can we challenge it?" Greg asked. "Maybe. But it won't be quick. If he did it legally, meaning he got the right signatures and followed city protocols, then overturning it would take months, maybe longer. You'd have to prove fraud, and that's no easy task." Greg clenched his jaw. "I don't have months. My house is already falling apart." "Then you don't go after the land issue. You go after him," Eric said. "There's always something. A guy who pulls a move like this has skeletons. You find them, you expose them, and you make him wish he never messed with you." Greg hung up, his mind already racing. If he wanted leverage, he needed information more than just what he already knew. He started calling his neighbors, specifically the ones who had lived in the area the longest. At first, they were hesitant. No one wanted to get involved in someone else's fight, especially not when Michael Crane was involved. But as Greg pressed, dropping small details about the land transfer, about how the city had conveniently overlooked violations on Michael's property, the dam started to break. Richard, the old man who walked his dog every morning, was the first to really talk. "That guy's been screwing the system for years," he grumbled. "You ever notice how he never gets fined for the crap he pulls? The noise, the illegal additions to his house, the trash piling up in his yard. Anyone else would have been cited 100 times over, but not him." Greg frowned. "You think he has someone on the inside?" Richard nodded. "I don't think I know. A couple years back, he was dumping construction debris onto my property. I filed complaints, had photos, dates, everything. And you know what happened? The case disappeared. Just vanished. No one would give me a straight answer. That's when I knew he had someone pulling strings for him." Greg's stomach twisted. If Michael had connections in the city's planning or enforcement departments, it explained a lot. But it also meant he wasn't untouchable, just careful. And careful men made mistakes. The next call he made was to a private investigator. He didn't know if it would lead anywhere, but if Michael had dirty secrets, Greg needed someone who knew how to dig them up. 2 days later, the investigator, a woman named Dana Walsh, called him back. "Your guy's a real piece of work," she said, a note of amusement in her voice. "He's got a rap sheet of violations, but none of them ever stuck. Every complaint just disappeared." But that's not the interesting part. The real fun starts when you look at his financials. Greg leaned forward. "What about them?" "He's been moving money around. A lot of it. Shell companies, offshore accounts, transactions that don't make sense. I don't know what he's into, but I can tell you this guys like him don't like having people poking around in their business." Greg exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this was worse. "Can we use it?" Dana paused. "Depends. You want to play it clean, or do you want to put real pressure on him?" Greg didn't answer right away. The clean way meant lawsuits, filing official complaints, waiting for city investigations to crawl through red tape. The other way meant making Michael feel the same kind of pressure Greg had been feeling for the past week. "I need him to feel cornered," Greg finally said. "Then I'd start by making some calls," Dana said. "The IRS loves when people tip them off about unreported assets. Banks don't like when a guy suddenly moves large sums of money. Get enough eyes on him, and his whole foundation starts to shake." Greg didn't sleep much that night. His mind was running a mile a minute, strategizing, planning, anticipating. By the next morning, he was already setting the wheels in motion. He filed official complaints with the city about the fraudulent land adjustments. He sent anonymous tips to financial regulators about Michael's suspicious transactions. He reached out to local news outlets with an anonymous tip about corruption in the city planning department. And then, just to twist the knife, he had a professional engineering firm conduct a structural inspection of Michael's house. If there was anything illegal or unsafe about it, the city would be forced to act. Days passed, and then the cracks started to show. Michael's bank accounts were flagged for suspicious activity. The city launched an internal audit into the land adjustments. Inspectors started showing up at his house, asking questions, looking for violations. And Michael, who had always been so smug, so untouchable, finally looked rattled. One evening, Greg was sitting on his porch, watching the sunset, when he heard heavy footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Michael standing at the edge of his driveway, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with something darker. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Michael said, his voice low. Greg didn't bother playing dumb. "I think I want what's owed to me." Michael's jaw twitched. "You have no idea what you've just done." Greg stood, crossing his arms. "Neither do you." For a long moment, they stared each other down, the air thick with tension. And then, without another word, Michael turned and walked away. Greg watched him go, feeling a rare sense of satisfaction settle in his chest. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time since this nightmare started, he knew one thing for certain. Michael Crane was finally scared. Greg Baird had always believed that persistence was the key to getting what you wanted. He had built his business through sheer determination, refusing to accept setbacks as anything more than temporary obstacles. But as the days passed and his war with Michael Crane escalated, he realized that persistence alone wasn't going to be enough. He needed strategy, precision, and the kind of ruthlessness that made people like Michael think twice before crossing him. And most importantly, he needed to make sure that every move he made forced Michael further into a corner. The first real sign that the pressure was working came early one morning when Greg stepped outside to find a notice taped to Michael's front door. From across the street, he could see the bold lettering official inspection notice and knew exactly what it meant. The city had finally responded to the complaints he had filed about the structural integrity of Michael's house, which, given the number of illegal modifications and shortcuts Greg suspected, was going to be a serious problem for him. He allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction before heading back inside, but he knew better than to get comfortable. Michael wasn't the type to sit back and accept defeat. That same afternoon, Greg received a call from Dana Walsh, the private investigator he had hired to dig into Michael's finances and connections. She sounded amused, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one. "I have to say, Greg, I didn't expect this guy to be so sloppy. He's been funneling money through shell companies, sure, but his real problem? He's got outstanding tax issues that have somehow slipped through the cracks. He owes the state a significant amount in back taxes. And that's the kind of thing that, if pushed in the right direction, can turn his life into a nightmare. Greg leaned against his desk, his mind racing. Can we make sure it doesn't keep slipping through the cracks? Dana chuckled. Already ahead of you. I've got a contact at the revenue office who loves cases like this, people who think they're untouchable. I'd give it about a week before Michael gets a very unfriendly letter in the mail. Greg exhaled, feeling the pieces fall into place. He had gone after Michael on multiple fronts. The city was investigating his property, his finances were under scrutiny, and now the government itself was about to become a very real problem for him. But even with all that, Greg knew it wasn't enough. Michael had gotten away with too much for too long, and if he truly wanted to win this, he needed to strip away every advantage his neighbor had ever relied on. The next step came from an unexpected place. That evening, Richard, the older neighbor who had initially been hesitant to get involved, stopped by Greg's house. He had a folder in his hands, thick with paperwork. "Thought you might find this interesting," he said, handing it over. Greg flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing. It was a collection of old complaints, filed by different people in the neighborhood over the past several years. Noise violations, property disputes, multiple reports of suspicious activity, each one documented, and in almost every case, quietly dismissed. It was a pattern, a clear indication that Michael had been getting special treatment from someone inside the system. Richard sighed. "I've lived here long enough to know that guys like him don't just get lucky. Someone's been covering for him, and I'd bet money that if you push hard enough, you'll find out who." Greg nodded, his mind already spinning. If he could prove that Michael had an inside connection protecting him, it would not only explain how he had gotten away with so much, but it would also give Greg the final piece of leverage he needed. The opportunity to test that theory came sooner than expected. 2 days later, Greg was working in his home office when he saw a car pull up in front of Michael's house. A man in a suit stepped out, walking quickly to the door. Greg recognized him immediately. David Rains, a mid-level official in the city's zoning department. He had seen the name on paperwork before, always attached to cases that had mysteriously gone in Michael's favor. And now, here he was, meeting with Michael in broad daylight. Greg grabbed his phone and snapped a few photos from his window. He didn't need audio to know what was happening. Rains looked tense, gesturing sharply while Michael leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed, a smirk plastered across his face. Whatever was being said, Greg could guess the gist of it. Michael was nervous. The walls were closing in, and he was calling in favors to try and stop it. That night, Greg made a calculated move. He sent an anonymous email to the local news station, attaching the photos and summarizing what he had uncovered about Michael's history with the zoning department. He knew better than to expect immediate results. Journalists moved cautiously with stories like this, but he also knew that once the right people started asking questions, the entire situation could spiral out of Michael's control. Meanwhile, the cracks in Michael's confidence were beginning to show. The next morning, as Greg was walking to his mailbox, Michael stormed across the street, his face flushed with anger. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" he spat. Greg didn't even blink. "I think I'm getting what's owed to me." Michael's fists clenched at his sides. "You're making a mistake. You don't know who you're messing with." Greg tilted his head. "That's funny. I was about to say the same thing to you." For a long moment, Michael just stood there, breathing heavily, his jaw tight. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his house. But Greg knew it wasn't over. Michael was the kind of man who fought dirty, and if he was backed into a corner, he wasn't going to play fair. Later that day, Greg received an email from Eric Stanton, his lawyer. The subject line was simple: "You're going to want to see this." Attached was a scanned document, a recently filed lawsuit against Greg, claiming defamation and harassment. The complaint accused Greg of spreading false information, making threats, and attempting to incite community action against Michael. It was baseless, flimsy, and full of exaggerations, but it was also exactly the kind of move Michael would make when he felt desperate. Greg leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Michael was trying to flip the narrative, to paint himself as the victim. It was a gamble, and one that could work if Greg didn't handle it correctly. But instead of feeling cornered, Greg smiled. Because filing a lawsuit meant putting things on record. It meant paperwork, financial disclosures, official testimonies, and that was the last thing Michael needed right now. Greg picked up the phone and called Eric. "We're not just going to fight this," he said. "We're going to use it." Michael thought he had just bought himself time. Instead, he had just given Greg the final weapon he needed to destroy him. Greg Baird had expected Michael Crane to lash out eventually, but filing a lawsuit was a sign of desperation. The man had spent years skating through legal loopholes, greasing the right palms, and twisting the system to his advantage. Now, with everything closing in around him, he was trying to flip the narrative, to make Greg look like the aggressor. It might have worked if Greg didn't know exactly how to turn this against him. Instead of seeing it as a threat, he saw it as an opportunity. His attorney, Eric Stanton, had the same reaction when Greg called him. "This is a gift," Eric said. Michael thinks he's buying time, but what he's really done is open himself up to scrutiny. A lawsuit means discovery, financial disclosures, depositions. He just invited us to dig into his affairs, and we're going to take full advantage of it. Greg spent the next few days gathering everything he had: emails, witness statements from neighbors, financial documents related to the damages. He wasn't going to just fight this lawsuit. He was going to use it to expose Michael for everything he had done, past and present. And if Michael thought that a legal battle would intimidate him, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. A few days later, as Greg was leaving his house, he noticed something different across the street. Michael, who had spent the past week avoiding him, was standing in his driveway, arguing with two men in dark suits. Greg didn't recognize them, but their demeanor told him everything. These weren't lawyers, they were from the bank. Michael's voice was raised, his posture tense. He was trying to argue, trying to stall, but the men didn't look impressed. One of them handed him a folder before turning and walking back to a black sedan parked nearby. Michael stood there for a long moment, flipping through the papers with a clenched jaw. Then, as if feeling Greg's eyes on him, he looked up. For the first time since this whole thing started, Greg saw something unfamiliar in his expression: fear. Greg had known that getting the IRS and financial regulators involved would cause trouble for Michael, but seeing the consequences in real time was something else entirely. It meant the pressure was working. It meant Michael was finally feeling what it was like to have someone take something from him. That night, Greg received a call from Dana Walsh, the private investigator. "Your boy's in trouble," she said without preamble. "The bank visit today?" That was the start. Turns out Michael's been juggling multiple mortgages, using one property's value to secure loans on another. But with his accounts under investigation and the land adjustment case getting traction, the bank's getting nervous. They're looking into whether he committed fraud to secure those loans. Greg exhaled slowly. If they find something, what happens? "They'll freeze his assets," Dana said. "Worst case, they start foreclosure proceedings. Best case for him? He's stuck in a legal battle trying to keep what he's got, which means no more easy money for him to throw around." Greg nodded, absorbing the information. "And what about his city connections? Any movement there?" Dana chuckled. "Funny you should ask. That zoning official, David Raines? He's in hot water. The city's launching an internal investigation into his handling of property adjustments, and guess whose name is all over the reports? If Raines goes down, Michael loses his protection." It was happening faster than Greg had expected. The cracks in Michael's world weren't just appearing, they were widening. The next morning, as Greg was sipping his coffee on the porch, Michael came storming across the street. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced with raw anger. "You think this is funny?" he snapped, stopping just short of Greg's steps. Greg took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "I think justice is overdue." Michael's hands balled into fists. "You don't get it, do you? You're screwing with things you don't understand. You think this is about your house? This is bigger than you." Greg set his cup down. "You're right. It's bigger than me. It's about every person you've screwed over, every rule you've bent. Every time you walked away while someone else paid the price. And now it's your turn." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "You really think you're some kind of hero? You're just another idiot who doesn't know when to quit." Greg stood up, closing the distance between them. "And you're a con man who finally ran out of places to hide." Michael held his glare for a moment longer before turning on his heel and storming back to his house. Greg watched him go, knowing that this wasn't over. Michael still had cards to play, but they were running out fast. 2 days later, the first sign of true collapse arrived in the form of a cease and desist letter from Michael's lawyer, a desperate attempt to shut Greg up. It was laughable. Greg's own legal team tore through it in minutes, sending back a formal response that not only rejected Michael's claims but also included new evidence from financial investigators linking him to fraudulent land deals. The next blow came from the city itself. An official notice was posted on Michael's door, marking his property for a structural review. A direct result of Greg's engineering complaints, it meant city inspectors were now required to go through every inch of his home, looking for violations. If they found anything serious, Michael wouldn't just be facing fines, he'd be looking at mandatory repairs, possible demolition orders, and legal consequences he couldn't bribe his way out of. And then, just when Greg thought things couldn't get worse for Michael, the news story broke. It started as a small segment on the local station, barely 3 minutes long. But it was enough. The footage showed Michael's connections with city officials, documents of shady land deals, even hints of financial misconduct. The moment it aired, the calls started flooding and city officials scrambling to cover themselves, reporters sniffing around for more information. The pressure on Michael went from bad to catastrophic. That night, as Greg was locking up, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You don't know what you've started." Greg stared at the screen for a long moment before deleting the message. He knew exactly what he had started. And he wasn't stopping now. Greg Baird had expected Michael Crane to fight until the bitter end. He had expected the man to claw, scratch, and manipulate his way out of the mess he had created, to find some last-minute loophole, some connection to bail him out. But as the walls closed in, as the investigations piled on, as the bank seized his assets and his legal troubles became insurmountable, something in Michael broke. He stopped trying to fight back publicly. The smugness was gone, replaced with something hollow, something unhinged. His house was no longer the center of loud, obnoxious gatherings. The cars that once filled his driveway disappeared one by one. His presence in the neighborhood, once so overbearing, was reduced to an occasional shadow behind closed curtains. But Greg wasn't stupid. He knew a man like Michael didn't just accept defeat. He was waiting, watching, looking for some way to turn the tables again. The first real sign that Michael had reached his breaking point came late one night. Greg had just locked up the house when he heard something outside, a slow, deliberate scraping sound against his front door. He froze, listening. The street was empty. No footsteps, no voices, just that eerie, dragging noise. He turned on the porch light and opened the door, but the porch was empty. Only when he looked down did he see it, a pile of shattered glass, soaked in what looked like oil, with a single, half-burned match lying beside it. A message. A threat. Michael was desperate, and desperate men did stupid things. Greg stepped back inside, locked the door, and called his attorney. It was time to finish this. The next morning, Greg received an email from Dana Walsh, the private investigator marked urgent. She had spent weeks pulling every piece of information she could find on Michael, digging into every record, every financial transaction, every legal loophole. But now she had something even bigger. Michael wasn't just in trouble with the bank and the city, he was in trouble with people who didn't settle their disputes in court. He's been borrowing money from the wrong people, Dana said over the phone. Large amounts, untraceable sources. We're talking about underground lenders, Greg. The kind that don't send lawyers when payments stop coming in. Greg felt a chill run down his spine. He had wanted Michael to pay for what he had done, but he had never considered that the man might have been playing with fire long before this war even started. That same afternoon, Greg watched as 2 black SUVs pulled up in front of Michael's house. The men who stepped out weren't city officials, weren't bank representatives. They were something else. They knocked once, then let themselves inside. 10 minutes later, they left, and Michael never emerged. Greg didn't know what had been said, but he didn't need to. Michael's problems had just gone from legal to personal. By the end of the week, Michael Crane was gone. No moving trucks. No official notice. One night he was there, and the next, his house sat empty, a foreclosure sign slapped onto the front door by the bank. His car disappeared. His social media accounts were deleted. His phone was disconnected. No one saw where he went, and no one was asking. Greg stood outside that morning, staring at the empty house, at the broken mailbox, at the faint outline of tire marks on the driveway. He had won. He had taken everything from Michael, forced him out of the life he had built on corruption and manipulation. But as he turned back toward his own home, he couldn't shake the feeling creeping up his spine. That night, Greg checked his security cameras, something he hadn't done in a while. He scanned through the footage, flipping through hours of nothingness, just a quiet street, an abandoned house. But then, just after midnight, movement. A figure at the edge of his property. A shadow standing by the tree line, unmoving, watching. The quality wasn't clear enough to make out a face, but Greg didn't need to. He already knew who it was. Michael wasn't finished. Greg Baird had spent weeks tearing Michael Crane's life apart, dismantling every advantage, every scheme, every illusion of power the man had. He had exposed his financial fraud, stripped him of his property, destroyed his standing in the neighborhood, and forced him into a corner where there was no easy escape. And yet, as Greg sat in his living room that evening, staring at the security footage of the shadow lingering near his property, he realized something unsettling. Michael wasn't done. The man had lost everything, but instead of running, instead of disappearing into obscurity, he was still here. Watching, waiting, planning. Greg felt a slow burn of frustration mixed with unease. He had expected Michael to either go out fighting or vanish entirely. But this was something worse. The next morning, Greg called Dana Walsh. The private investigator had been instrumental in dismantling Michael's empire, and if anyone could figure out what the man was planning next, it was her. She listened as Greg explained the security footage, the unsettling feeling that Michael hadn't actually left, despite the foreclosure, despite losing everything. There was a long pause before she finally spoke. "Greg, there's something you need to know," she said, her voice carefully measured. "Michael didn't just lose his house. His accounts are frozen, his assets are tied up in legal battles, and his debts are substantial. The kind of debts that don't just disappear because the bank takes your property." Greg clenched his jaw. "You mean the loans he took from the underground lenders?" "Exactly." "And the fact that he hasn't left? That's not good news for you," Dana continued. "If he had a way out, he would have taken it. But he's got nowhere to go, no resources, and people looking for him. And that makes him dangerous." Greg exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had wanted Michael to suffer, to lose everything the way he had tried to make Greg lose his home. But he had never considered that the man might become a true threat once he had nothing left to lose. "So what do I do?" Greg asked. Dana sighed. "You need to assume he's desperate. And desperate people don't think rationally. They lash out. They go after whoever they blame for their downfall. And Greg, you're at the top of that list." Greg already knew that. He could feel it in his bones. The fight wasn't over, not yet. That night, Greg reinforced his home security, double-checking every lock, testing every camera. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't stupid either. He had won this war by being methodical, by thinking ahead. He wasn't going to let Michael take anything back. But as the hours dragged on, as he sat in the dim glow of his living room, watching the camera feeds, a different kind of exhaustion settled over him. He had spent weeks consumed by this battle, by the need to bring Michael down, and now, even with his victory secured, he couldn't shake the feeling that it had cost him something. He had built his life on control, on order, on the belief that hard work and discipline could solve any problem. But this wasn't business. This wasn't a deal gone bad. This had been war, and war always left scars. At 3:17 a.m., The motion sensors outside his house tripped. Greg's heart pounded as he grabbed his phone, pulling up the live feed from his security cameras. And there, at the edge of the property, partially obscured by the darkness, was a figure, standing still, watching. Michael. Greg stood, his body tense, his mind racing. He could call the police, but Michael wasn't doing anything yet. He could go outside, confront him, but that was exactly what Michael wanted. No, Greg wouldn't play into his game. Instead, he picked up his phone and sent a single text. "You have 60 seconds to leave before I make a call that ends this for good." The figure remained motionless for several heartbeats. Then, slowly, it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. Greg didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat by the window, watching, waiting. But Michael didn't return. By morning, Greg made his decision. He called Dana first. Find out where he's staying. If he's still in town, I want to know. Next, he called Eric Stanton, his attorney. I want a restraining order filed today. And finally, he made one last call to a man whose services he had never needed before. I want a full private security detail. Unmarked. I don't care what it costs. Greg had spent weeks taking Michael apart piece by piece. He wasn't about to let the bastard crawl back out of whatever hole he had been buried in. And if Michael Crane wanted to keep playing this game, Greg would make sure it ended permanently. 3 days later, Dana called back. Michael's gone. Greg frowned. Gone where? No one knows. No flights, no bus tickets, no rental cars. He just disappeared. Greg stared out his office window, gripping his phone tighter. He should have felt relieved. This was what he wanted. But instead, a slow unease crept into his chest. Michael Crane had spent his entire life manipulating people, twisting the system in his favor. And now, after losing everything, he had simply vanished? That didn't feel like surrender. That felt like something worse. That night, Greg checked his security cameras one last time before heading to bed. The street was empty. The house across the street was dark, abandoned. The battle was over. At least that's what he told himself. Because deep down, he knew men like Michael never truly disappeared. They just waited.